and good evening, everyone. As we begin tonight, I'd like to mention that although we'll be focusing particularly on the Black, Latino, and Native American communities, we know that there are other people of color who have been erased from the narrative when it comes to abuse in the church. And that includes Asian American and Pacific Islander communities. While we won't be addressing those communities directly in our conversation, we want to keep this reality in mind as we hear from our panelists this evening. So with that said, let's dive into the first questions for our panelists. I'd like to ask this of all three of our panelists, but Father Bryan, let's start with you. How has racism played a role in making Black, Latino, and Native communities vulnerable to abuse?
Thank you, and first thank Awake for having this very difficult conversation. It's one of the few venues where the spotlight has been turned upon how this terrible plague of clergy sexual abuse has affected communities of color. So thank you for this opportunity. I think one of the ways to get at this is to tell a story, and it comes from the Milwaukee area. In the 1990s, there was a priest in Milwaukee's Central City that was basically abusing Black young boys by showing them, and I quote from the diocese's own website, saying of showing them dirty movies, nasty movies, and then having sex with them. And this was a letter of complaint that came in from a Black parishioner. And her words were, she wanted to tell the story because, and I quote, she didn't want the inner city to be missed or forgotten, close quote. And I think that's how racism has affected communities of color in general, but especially African-American communities. We're invisible. We are invisible. When we look and when we think of the image of the typical, clergy victim survivor, we think of someone who is white, often male. The literature has white faces. The leadership of the organizations are basically white. And what that communicates is that there's no room for the trauma that victims of color of clergy sexual abuse have experienced. This is on top of the historic lack of sensitivity that the Catholic Church has shown to Black Catholics around the country in terms of the closure of our parishes, the mergers of our schools, the abandonment of our communities. And often these plans have taken place without any real meaningful consultation with the Black Catholic community. And so I think all of those are ways. And I think another way in which racism plays a role is that some of the terminology that we use for the community doesn't necessarily resonate with African Americans. So for example, we usually use the term victim survivor. But when I talk to members, Black men in particular, who have been abused by priests, one of them said to me, I don't feel like I'm surviving anything. I'm just coping. I do what I do because I have to cope. And so I've often said that when I'm talking about the Black Catholic community, I use the word coper because I think it means that that's a more culturally resonant term, at least among some Black Catholic men who have been victimized. So I think in all of those ways, the terminology, the faces, the literature, the leadership, and simply the general feeling that our pain is invisible. I think these are the ways in which racism initially affects Black Catholics in particular.
Excellent. Thank you, Father Bryan, for getting us started with those ideas. Maka, let's go to you next. How has racism played a role in making Native communities vulnerable to abuse?
Well, first, Haamitakepi, Maka Black Elk and Machapalo, Chante Washtena Pechuzapalo. Just so thankful to be here. As was mentioned, I'm Maka Black Elk, and I greet all of you with a warm, heartfelt handshake. I do think this topic is extremely important, and for a lot of folks, I think just the history of Native peoples is relatively unknown in general in this country. And so it's really important to take some time to talk about this and to make sense of the history that Native peoples have experienced. I mean, I think it's clear that for Native peoples in this country, racism is not simply an act of simple prejudice beyond that's rooted in skin color. It's also in many ways rooted in the attempted genocide of Native peoples. And through genocide, the experiences of Native peoples and through the eradication, in particular of family, is one of the bases by which the Catholic Church has given its or sort of one of the ways in which the Catholic Church has constituted this particular experience in Native communities, particularly through the boarding school history, which I know is something I am rooted in deeply right now in the work I do. The boarding school history in the United States is something that also a lot of people don't know about. The Catholic Church ran many of those schools, and Native peoples went through those schools generation through generation. And it was that removal from family and the access that the boarding schools gave to predatory clergy that allowed for that kind of abuse to happen and occur. So it was, the history itself is rooted in that sort of colonial experience, rooted in the separation of family, rooted in a kind of dehumanization. And that kind of thinking continued even beyond the boarding school period itself into the latter half of the 19th century and the 20th century, as you see in various cases across the country, that even when there were priests who were discovered or uncovered as abusers within the church itself, the, of course, initial attempt was to remove that priest and relocate him somewhere else. Often they were relocated to tribal communities because they were remote, because they were isolated, and because even if they did abuse there, the impact was perhaps far less or less noticeable or less consequential. And I think that's the kind of dehumanization and the thinking behind it that leads to that kind of outcome. So the impact has been multi-generational. And today in Native country, Native America, you can see lots of issues with sexual abuse in families that seem to be intergenerational in their challenges, and many of folks can trace that back to their time in boarding school, whether that was a boarding school run by the Catholic Church or by the government or et cetera, but it was that whole sweeping experience that allowed for that kind of thing to happen, and that therefore has now planted that seed that continues to germinate in families generation after generation. That Native peoples have been really working for decades now to overcome and to recover and to find resilience. And many are doing that today, but it's something that we really need to continue to keep on top of and work on and talk about.
Excellent. Thank you so much for helping us to understand. Thank you. Jeremy, let's go to you then. How has racism played a role in making Latino communities vulnerable to abuse?
So first, I'm just going to flag that I'll use the gender inclusive term Latinas rather than only Latinos or repeating Latinos and Latinas. I do this out of respect for Latinas, women, and gender non-binary people. It's an increasingly common identity term, but it's also, I'd also acknowledge that most people still prefer and use the masculine form Latinos. So I just wanted to explain that. I think one way to come at this is to ask the question, how does political and economic injustice, which racism is embedded within, how does that create traumas and dependencies that make people more vulnerable to powerful figures within the church? Or put differently, how does the violence of racism outside and inside the church make Black, Indigenous, and other people of color vulnerable to church violence. So, when we're talking about Latina communities in particular, we can talk about how the traumas and vulnerabilities of racism, whether it's manifested in economics or manifested in border and migration policies or denial of citizenship or racialized policing, et cetera. We can talk about all of these ways that create traumas and that create instances where people have been dispossessed of some of their resources. There's a loss of relationships and a loss of access to social goods. All of these things create more dependencies in racialized communities such that they're then also vulnerable to powerful figures within the church. I think it's important that, just to underscore what we've already heard, that racism isn't simply another social issue alongside sexual abuse, but rather is a systemic form of harm or violence. It's the very landscape within which sex abuse occurs, both in white communities and in communities of color. Racism as a systemic reality affects all contemporary social and church issues in the US because it's part of the larger political and economic system within which all issues arise, whether we're talking about voting rights, employment, medical care access, entertainment, and yes, church institutions and sexual violence.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you for laying that groundwork for our conversation tonight. I'd like to talk specifically about the barriers that people of color have experienced and still experience today in reporting abuse and pursuing justice. Father Bryan, can you start us off on that question?
Well, that's really important. I think that most victim survivors have reported that when they make their report, they don't feel believed, they don't feel credible. And I think that that's a common experience, but I also think that there are unique ways in which I'll speak specifically from the Black experience that it manifests itself. First is that if you are perceived as not being able to speak standard white English, then your testimony is seen as uncredible by white listeners. So the inability to speak standard, unaccented Midwestern English is automatic. If you sound Black, to put it bluntly, then you're not going to be seen as credible. If you come across as too angry, then again, you're the angry Black man or the angry Black woman, and your testimony is seen as uncredible. Another barrier is that many of those who are charged with being the point of contact in many dioceses and religious orders, many of them lack the cultural competence to listen and to be present to Black people or others of color. One of the things I've heard across in my research is that some victim assistance coordinators are unaware or unfamiliar with inner city neighborhoods. They don't know how to speak with Black men, and also, to be honest, Black people find it very hard to be vulnerable and to talk about the intimate violation of their body to someone who may look like the person who did this harm to them. Another thing we need to talk about is how bodies of color are sexually coded or understood in our society. Especially Black women are seen as being loose and promiscuous. Black men as being sexually rapacious and irresponsible. Therefore, there's a kind of presumption that in many cases, the victim did something to bring this on. And so I think these are another barrier that we find, especially among Black communities is that there's a fear of bringing forth your testimony, especially to law enforcement, when doing so may call attention to your own vulnerability or precarity with law enforcement. There's a long history of a distrust of the law enforcement community in the Black community for many reasons, going back generations. And so there's a real hesitancy to do that, especially if by doing so, I may call attention to the fact that I may have a parole violation or something like this. I think all of these are ways that really affect our barriers that are real problems, real obstacles for Black communities to be heard and to bring forth their testimony. I think just the general fact of who's going to believe me. As one person told me in my research, they don't even believe white victims. Why are they going to believe me? And especially if I'm going to go against a white priest who has a graduate education, who knows the system, and in many cases, I don't. I think these are all barriers that people of color experience and have experienced when it comes to bringing forth their stories to be heard in the faith community.
Thank you. Thank you for explaining that. Maka, could you speak to the barriers that Native people have experienced in reporting abuse and pursuing justice?
Yeah, I think some of the things that Father Massingale has talked about are very similar to what some of the community members in different tribes experience as well. I think some of the things that we've learned from the sexual abuse crisis in general is that the bishops and the clergy are very fearful of the loss of funds, especially in lawsuits that would lead to different kinds of financial crises for the church. And so in order to avoid that in different ways, they've responded and lobbied in different ways to try and mitigate or even limit the ability for people to do that. But unfortunately, the Catholic Church has provided no other mechanism by which victims, survivors, and others can achieve even a kind of justice beyond the court system, which is right now the only place, right? But so, for example, in South Dakota, the bishops, the Catholic Conference in South Dakota, lobbied explicitly for a statute of limitations law that explicitly targeted people who would have been survivors of clergy sexual abuse through the boarding school system. And so that meant that in the law, it now is the case that you cannot, if you are older than a certain age, I think it's older than now 25 years old, then you cannot seek to pursue through the court system any kind of case for that would include the bringing about of reparations through financial resources against anyone except the person who was the perpetrator themselves beyond a certain age. And so that means that anyone above that age can't pursue a redress through the court system that doesn't target the actual perpetrator. And so that means that they're essentially, usually these perpetrators are now deceased. And so there really is no recourse now for them to find that justice. It would be one thing if the Catholic Church lobbied for that kind of particular law in order to protect themselves, but then provided some sort of alternative pathway for healing and reconciliation and justice through some other means, but they've not done that either. And so I think there's something really incredible to be said about that in terms of, especially here in South Dakota, where that law was passed specifically to protect the church in the state from victims who were in the Catholic boarding school system here.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. Jeremy, I'd like to have you weigh in on barriers. What do you have to add to that?
Yeah, so I'll co-sign everything that has been said previously as being relevant to Latina communities. And, for example, what Bryan talks about related to language is also, for example, Spanish and indigenous languages, those barriers exist there as well, and are very significant barriers, as well as fear of law enforcement. I would just add to that concerns around immigration, ICE, border enforcement, customs, border fears of deportation. I think to add on to what I was saying earlier about dependencies that racism creates that end up making communities more vulnerable to church leaders, it's fairly common. I would say it's a very common experience for Latinas to have priests who are not culturally competent. There's, whether it's Spanish language or it's the specifics of the geographic, ethnic, generational background of the communities. And so, we've talked often about how abuser priests are often people who are very charismatic and liked. And that's having that priest is often a rare experience in Latina communities. And so there are increased pressures not to report when it's, we finally got a good one. We finally got one who's competent, who speaks the language, who's culturally competent, et cetera. So that creates a significant barrier. Additionally, I would say a cultural barrier in terms of the dominant culture in the United States. There's a culture of productivity and moving on, a kind of historical amnesia that we want to turn the page, we want to put this behind us, we want to let's move on from this. And one of the most important things I heard when I was a coordinator of youth ministry in California, Bishop Gerald Barnes, who is now retired, was the bishop at the time, and we had a number of significant cases in the Diocese of San Bernardino. And I remember him saying to a meeting of ministers, don't expect to take this off your desk and to move on. It was one of the most significant things, because what it was signaling was that there are going to be slow drip, incremental revelations from distant and more recent sexual violence and cover-ups committed within the church, and that the ministers had a responsibility to see this as part of competent ministry and part of competent membership in our communities, and not as a problem to clean up, deal with, and move on from. And I think that's a very countercultural thing in the United States. We have, especially as, now, the media cycle, 24-hour media cycle, social media, et cetera, we have very short attention spans, and there's a definite kind of historical amnesia. I would add to that, especially for men who've suffered this violence, anti-LGBT sentiment outside the church and inside the church, and toxic masculinity, or I would, to connect it to this conversation, colonizer masculinity, enhances the shame. If you're a man or a boy who's been victimized by a priest, the shame is enhanced by a kind of culture that constructs this violence as homosexuality and then shames homosexuality. And that's significant in these communities, not only in Latina communities, but I would say communities, regardless of racial background. I'd probably add, lastly, distrust of women's testimony, whether it's women who've suffered the violence, or it's women who are the majority workforce of the church and who are often the people who community members come to report. I can think of, for example, there was a beloved Monsignor when I worked in California, Peter Lukey, who was credibly accused, removed from ministry, credibly accused of multiple incidents related to children. And the sister of one of the victims had been, she had claimed that he confessed to her directly, but for decades she wasn't trusted and believed. And ultimately, I think he was not criminally prosecuted because of a decision that came down from the Supreme Court. I think he was prosecuted in a civil case, but this was just one example of a distrust of women's testimony that that is emblematic. And I guess I would just, maybe one more thing. I said that would be the last, but clericalism is the big kind of elephant in the room. Treating clericalism as just symbolic or ideological, a father knows best culture, it fails to attend to the material and institutional relationships, or those dependencies I was talking about that create dominance and vulnerability. And related to this, the common refrain, "This was an abuse of power," doesn't lead us to question why power was created and distributed or seized in the church in this manner in the first place. So, for ordinary Catholics, it's incumbent upon us who feel called to remain in the church, those who feel called to remain in the church, we need to respond to this violence and take action toward reconstructing the material and structural relationships of what it means to be church in order to reduce harm and ensure restitution, healing, and accountability.
Can I jump in? Jeremy opened up an important point. I think it was really relevant in the African American community, and that is the shame that surrounds especially same-sex violation, and how that can be coded as anti-LGBTQ prejudice. But I want to highlight something particularly dynamic, and that is the difficulty that Black men may experience in reporting being sexually violated, especially by a white man. I mean, I think this is a very sensitive topic, but we need to talk about it because it's very relevant to this issue, that for a Black man to have to admit publicly that he has lost control of his own sexual body, and that happened by a white man, I think really I can't imagine too many Black men who would want to admit to that publicly, and then to have to admit that happened to another white person. That can be even more traumatic, because I think we need to look at the fact in which how race has been used as a power means to basically subjugate people and to let them know that you're not in charge, you're not in control. And I think that's a dynamic that we don't know how to talk about in our culture. We don't know how to talk about how the bodies of people of color are sexually coded, the sexual stereotypes that attend Black men, Latino women, Black women, Native peoples. And I think that's another, layer of complication, that it's an obstacle to people, feeling free to share their stories of a trauma and violation, especially in church settings.
Right. Thank you for sharing that. I'm wondering, do we have a sense, based on research, of the extent of the problem of abuse by church leaders in Latino, Black, and Native communities? Jeremy, I'd like to hear from you on that question first.
No, I mean, the gap in data is yawning. It's egregious. And I think that, there are a lot of implications for that. And I think there are real challenges. I mean, the best we can do right now is lift up stories of victims, of survivors, of people that are coping and hanging on to life after experiencing this trauma. I think we also need to look, until we get the kinds of investment in research, by lawyers, sociologists, anthropologists, other social scientists, what we can do is look to the patterns that exist in other institutions where power and vulnerability intersect, and whether it's sexual abuse by doctors in youth sports leagues, in non-religious school settings, et cetera, to look, we can at least estimate the some of the prevalence, and connect that to what we know about what the specific vulnerabilities are within the church, within church institutions. But we don't have reliable data, and it creates some real challenges. And I think one of the challenges it creates is a temptation, and I'm really trying to avoid falling into this, creates a temptation to kind of create broad brush stroke explanations of how these dynamics play out in communities of color based on cultural analysis and cultural studies. And so you end up hearing a lot of, there's a culture of machismo in Latino communities. There's a failure to appreciate the distinctiveness, the diversity of these communities. And, because we don't have reliable scientific data to rely on.
Right. Father Bryan, you and I have also talked a little bit about this. I wonder if you can share your perspective on the data.
Okay, well, in short, we don't have a lot of data. Every landmark study that we have, none of it addresses racial, ethnic, demography, or data. Whether we're talking about the John Jay report, the Jason Berry report, the Boston Globe's report, none of the reports that we have that are like the landmark studies, none of them make reference to racial or demographic information. If you read the reports, the presumption is that all of the victim survivor copers are all white. I mean, another thing we found out in my research is that when the Associated Press back in 2019 contacted the diocese and asked them if they recorded racial and ethnic identity data, first of the 178 that responded, that they contacted, only 88 responded. Of those, only 7 said they had racial or ethnic identity data, but they didn't want to release it for privacy concerns. And I have to say, editorially, I find that really hard to believe that all of a sudden the church is going to be concerned about victims when they haven't shown that kind of concern up until now. So I just have to really take that, with a huge block of salt. In my own research, I found only one diocese, the Diocese of Alexandria in Louisiana, that has a spreadsheet where they identify the race and ethnicity of those reported. They have not wanted to make that public. And they've only kept that data since 2015. So we know that there are Black, Asian, Native, and Latina victim survivors. We have no idea how many. And indeed, many dioceses have told researchers that those demographics, quote, aren't relevant. So we have a major problem here. The other problem we have, so in order to find this data, what you need to do is you need to go into each diocese website, because many dioceses have reached agreements, court-ordered agreements, where they have to publicize their files on a website. But even there, you need to know the layout of the diocese. You need to know the ethnic composition of that particular parish. You would also need to know if parishes were merged. So in doing my research, because I'm a priest of the Archdiocese of Milwaukee and I know the history, I know where to look. But you have to do that now for every diocese. And now we're even talking about religious orders. And so we're really behind the 8 ball. We're really we're not flying blind, because we have anecdotal reports that newspaper accounts have surfaced for us. But in terms of having an idea of the prevalence, we simply don't know.
Right. Thank you so much for sharing that. I just want to take a pause here for a moment to remind our audience that we welcome your questions. If you have questions for our panel, please send them to Catherine Questions through the chat function, and we'll get to our audience questions in a bit. Maka, you spoke about this at the beginning of our conversation, but I'd like to ask you a bit more about the history of residential schools and boarding schools, which were often run by the Catholic Church. Many in our audience know that earlier this year, Pope Francis visited Canada and apologized to Indigenous communities for the abuses that took place at the hands of the Catholic Church in Canada. I was wondering if you could talk to us a little bit about the history of Native boarding schools in the United States. And also, is it accurate to say that we are behind our neighbors in Canada in grappling with this history?
Yes, thanks, Erin. Yeah, the history that is, precedes Canada in the residential school history there that Pope Francis went and did his penitential pilgrimage for is the same history here in the United States. In fact, it starts here in the United States. Canada's model of residential school systems has its roots in the boarding school system that originated here under the auspices of the US government initially. And, in Canada, they had over roughly 150 residential schools, and the Catholic Church ran half of them. In the United States, there's now, we know, over potentially 500 boarding schools that existed across the country. And we know that the Catholic Church ran maybe over 100 of them. So the Catholic Church has an outsized role in the running of these boarding schools, and the ways in which those abuses occurred in those boarding schools are a direct result of their ability to have run them and receive federal funding for doing so. So that's, I think, an important part of recognizing that the church's history for Native people is rooted in this sort of colonial experience and this greater colonial project that was designed to, again, remove children from their families and bring them into these boarding schools as young as 5 years old and keep them there until they were of age. And it was very much a system that promulgated that different kind of abuse, whether it was from clergy, but also from older students, from lay staff. I mean, the possibility for abuse in an environment like that was so high. And we saw some of the ramifications of that in Alaska, where the Jesuits West actually went bankrupt because of the lawsuits that did finally come about from many Alaskan boarding schools that were run by the Jesuits who had significant experiences of abuse. And we're just now seeing some of the ramifications of people coming forward in different ways about that. And at least in Native America, we can geographically determine, much as to what Father Bryan has talked about as well, you can at least geographically determine where Native people are. And so that helps a little bit in finding out some of that history. But that's the experience of Native peoples in certainly the boarding school crisis and the way the boarding school panned out, and how the clergy sexual abuse crisis is interlinked, and really you can't disentangle those two.
Right. And are we, is Canada ahead in terms of sort of truth and reconciliation efforts between, directed toward Indigenous peoples?
I would say yes, to the extent by which, the Canadian government did formally go through a truth and reconciliation process for their residential school history that began in, I think, 2010 and ended formally in 2015. The problem with the truth and reconciliation process that it has a beginning and an end is that truly there's no such thing as reconciliation being done. And so today in Canada, we still see a lot of lingering challenges with the residential school history, with the Catholic Church's role in the residential school history. So I think it goes to show there's a lot more to do, but has the US even done that? No. So the US has a much bigger step to take. And I hope that looking at our Canadian neighbors' experience shows us that that it's possible and that it's long overdue.
Great. Yeah, thank you. Thanks for filling us in and helping us understand. I'd like to ask now about change in our church. What needs to change in our church's response to sexual abuse to better include people from Black, Latino, and Native communities? And Jeremy, I wonder if you can start us off on this question.
Yeah, I think it depends what we mean by church. And so I'm going to start with those of us in the room that still identify as church. I would say, one, identify and challenge Catholic institutional structures that enable violence and lack of accountability. And two, we need to form Catholic agents of, to borrow a word from Bryan, or a term, ecclesial reconstruction, in the pursuit of more egalitarian and democratic Catholic communities grounded in harm reduction, restitution, and mutual accountability to each other. We're increasingly aware that not just that clergy-controlled diocesan and parish modalities of Christian life are inadequate, but also that they present threats to life. However, many Catholics are neither working to change the church or working to deprive it of the centrally controlled and non-transparent. Many Catholics are not working to deprive these institutions of these centrally controlled and non-transparent institutions of the kinds of money and validation that they require in order to perpetuate domination, violence, and cover-ups. If we continue to respond in the same ways, born out of despair or denial or indifference, then we're going to deepen the crisis and deepen the betrayal of children and ourselves. In effect, we miss, to borrow from the book of Ecclesiastes, we miss that this season is a time to tear down. So we need strategies. We need strategies for tearing down current forms and building up new forms of church life. We can learn from theories of community organizing. We can learn from strategies like mutual aid initiatives, practices of community self-defense, and disruptive and creative direct action approaches that pressure dominant church stakeholders to change practices and policies. We can also draw on models of church life, old and new, Catholic and non-Catholic, to reconstruct communities more capable of carrying out the mission of the gospel with integrity. And I think Awake is a great example of this. I'm talking about developing programs and initiatives of theological and ministerial formation that form Catholics who are capable of creating and sustaining different ways of being church. Catholic confraternities, sodalities, house churches, trans-congregational organizations, ecumenical and interfaith associations, 501c organizations, and social movements. We have the capacity to reduce harm and cultivate restitution and accountability by contributing to the process of ecclesial transformation. And that starts with starving these non-transparent, non-participatory institutions of the money and the credibility they need to perpetuate. So, I think that's, at least in the big picture, I think that's how we respond.
Excellent. Thank you. Thanks. Father Bryan, I wonder if you can share ideas. What do you think needs to change in our church's response to sexual abuse to better include communities of color?
Well, let's start with the positive, and that's usually not where I usually start. So but I'm trying to be as optimistic as I can be. Let's start with the positive, and that is, we're only now beginning to talk about this issue. Up until last spring, with the Taking Responsibility initiative out of Fordham University, that was the first time that we had a series of encounters and a series of sessions devoted to the impact of clergy sexual abuse upon Native, Latine, Black, and Asian communities. So we're really, coming up on maybe the 15-month mark. And so really what we're doing tonight with Awake is a major step in the process. And you're saying, well, that's a pretty low bar. Well, that shows you how it shows you where we were. So we're still really in the infancy. So we need to continue doing things like this. Now, having said that, I think we also have to be honest and realize that every step that the Catholic Church has made on these issues has come not because the Catholic Church's leadership has voluntarily chose to do so. In other words, we are where we are because of the efforts of the victim survivor COPER communities putting pressure, bringing legal pressure, court-ordered pressure. The reason why we have access to Archdiocese files is because of court settlements. So I think going forward, what we need to do for communities of color is that in future court settlements, we need to require that dioceses and religious orders hire culturally competent and sensitive personnel who can work with communities of color, or if they can't hire them, then they have to be able to outsource this and bring in people who are culturally competent to deal with this. I think another thing we need to do is that we need to mandate through court-ordered settlements that dioceses and religious orders engage in the kind of research and truth and uncover the identities, the racial and ethnic identities of those who have been harmed and violated. I think we also need to require in future settlements that systems of religious seminary formation deal with the power dynamics that are racially and ethnically based. It's not enough to simply talk about everyone going through, safe environment training. I mean, yeah, that's the low-hanging fruit. But now I think we need to talk about, okay, how does race and ethnicity intersect with power and sexuality, and say that you cannot be ordained and you cannot exercise ministerial leadership in the Catholic Church without having seriously engaged that as part of your preparation for ministry. I think these are the things that need to be done, but I also think we need to be honest and realize that our history up until now has shown that the religious leadership will not do this voluntarily. They do this because they are forced to. And so I think that going forward, future settlements need to be done with an eye toward ensuring the kinds of truth that Maka was talking about, that we can begin to at least surface the information and require dioceses to hire people who are culturally competent and sensitive, or if they can't hire them, to outsource this to responsible people who will be trusted by the community so they can tell their stories and have some assurance that they'll be heard.
Thank you for that. Maka, what would you offer in terms of change that needs to happen in our church's response to sexual abuse, particularly in Native communities?
I mean, I would echo much of what my fellow panelists have said already in terms of the required change, and would simply add that, I think for Native America, there's this feeling, even amongst many Native people who are still Catholic and remain Catholic, that there's this sense of, the church spent century plus years working to evangelize and even change Native people, right, for the purpose of evangelism, and worked hard to do that, sacrificed lives, dollars to do that. We can argue whether or not much of that was good, but regardless, there is now today a real, I think, sense amongst Native Catholic communities of abandonment, of the church not being there or not being present or not giving that same sort of zeal that they had in evangelism, not giving that to healing and to caring for the legacy of that pain and hurt and trauma that their previous actions committed. So I think there needs to be an intentional recommitment, certainly to all of our communities of color, but a recommitment certainly to the healing from trauma, and a real sincere desire on the church's part to do that. I take Father Bryan's point so close to heart in the sense that, so far what the church has done, it has been forced to do. I want to see a church that does it regardless. And so how do we ask for that? And how do we change that? I think that's the change we need.
Thank you. Thank you. So I'd like to ask now, Awake Milwaukee is very aware of the fact that we have a lot to learn about how to serve victim survivors from communities of color. And so I'd like to ask our panelists, what do you think an organization like Awake can do to better welcome, listen to, and support people from Black, Latina, and Native communities? This is something that several audience members are asking about right now, sending in this question. Practical ideas for what we in the Awake community and in the broader Catholic community can do in light of the realities that you've been describing tonight. So Maka, I think maybe we could start with you, if that's okay.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think the work that Awake does is incredible. And I think intentional outreach to communities is essential. I think certainly I can speak for Native communities in the sense that broadly, right, there is a real need to be heard and identified, and for that relationship to be named, right? For that history to be acknowledged. And so I think in general, intentional outreach, intentional seeking of story, but also a deep need for learning, right? I think for so many communities outside of certainly Native America, there is so little knowledge about Native peoples and their continued existence, about their history, about what happened to them, about where they are. So many people have very limited views of Native communities, rooted in very simple things that they might know, casinos or poverty or alcoholism, whatever it might be, right? The different tropes that come forward. So a real education is necessary as well. And so I think that's what's required in order to especially do that outreach that's intentional, effectively, and with care.
Great, thank you. Thank you. Jeremy, could you offer your thoughts on what Awake Milwaukee and other Catholic organizations might be able to do to welcome communities of color?
I'm going to be maybe a little provocative and say, don't reach out, because the metaphor implies hands. I'm going to say, move your feet. If we're serious about settler colonial statehood or institutionalized whiteness or Anglo cultural dominance or normativity being foundational to violence, to sexual violence in the church, and to the cover-ups as well, and the lack of accountability. If we're serious about that, really accompanying these communities is going to change what Awake does, how Awake operates. And so I'm going to say, move your feet, don't reach out. And I think that looks like partnering with existing community leaders, investing in them because they are so underinvested in and undersupported by the church, especially lay ecclesial leadership in communities of color. The lack of leadership support is astounding, whether it's whether it's compensation for the work people do, or it's leadership development resources, et cetera. And I would say also invest in new leadership development. A challenge that communities of color often experience is that when white dominant organizations want to be helpful, they often they reach out but don't move their feet, and then they want to draw that leadership into the orbit of what they do, and it becomes a kind of leadership drain within these communities that are already really stretched for leadership that's well resourced and supported. And so I would encourage you to be mindful of that, and that's why I use the metaphor of moving your feet rather than reaching out, because it's not about getting more people to come to your meetings or the circles or all the important stuff you're doing, or getting more diverse leadership at the top of the organization, if that's not enhancing the communities that these leaders are already working really hard in to do the work of advocacy and healing.
Yeah, excellent. Thanks for that. It's thought-provoking. So Father Bryan, we'd like to hear from you as well. Ideas of what Awake and other Catholic organizations can do to welcome communities of color.
Okay, a couple of things. Let's start with the least provocative, and that is, do communities of color even know that you exist? Let's start with that. I would wonder, in terms of, let's start with the easy parts in terms of like, are your materials, bilingual or trilingual? Okay, let's start there. And so however you communicate in your website, is it available to people who, don't, that English is not their native language? So I think that's one thing. I think another thing is terms of racial hospitality, and that is to realize that when people of color enter into spaces that are predominantly white, many white people think that it's really their space. And as Jeremy said, is that when new members join a group, then the group changes. And is the group really willing to change? And I think part of what makes this a complicated discussion is that for victim, survivor, culprits of color to tell their stories, we can't tell our story without talking about how our racial identities have affected our experience. And yet, many white people feel threatened when we talk about racism, when we talk about how that impacts our story. And so to be honest about, is this group open to hearing a story which may make me uncomfortable, because I have to really then look at my own lack of racial sensitivity or racial awareness? I think that's a real, a challenge. And so at least to my most provocative, and that is, I think that Awake and other groups need to support the abilities of communities of color, for victims, survivor, copers, to come together in their own separate spaces to process their own healing first. I think in many cases, I think that Black, Latino, Native, and Asian folks need a safe space where we can talk about and do some of our own healing first before we enter into a white space and have to take on helping you help me, which is oftentimes it has to happen. And I do this without even taking up the sexuality part. I'm oftentimes, when I'm talking about race, I'm oftentimes helping white people to talk with me about race, which is doing a lot of work. And if I'm also trying to heal from my own sexual violation, that's a lot to expect. And so I think one of the things that Awake and other groups need to do is to help support the needs of a community to have their own safe spaces where they can do their healing first, before then asking them to enter into your space and to be a part of your healing journey too.
Can I just add really quickly to that?
Yeah, please.
That I would agree wholeheartedly and echo that, so often in these spaces, I think it's understood or assumed that the role of white folk in these spaces is to listen. And while that is true, I also deeply encourage those same kinds of conversations that people of color are being asked to have, that also white communities have those too, with themselves and with each other, right? So to not wait for necessarily for communities of color to do that for them or to do the labor for them. And so there does need to be that kind of racial labor happening amongst and within white communities as well, to talk about these kinds of things.
Can I just briefly add something as well? Bryan talked about separate spaces and has talked some about the racialization of sexual violence in Black communities. That really resonates for me as well. And Bryan and I have talked about it some. In Mexican Spanish, the worst curse word that you can say is hijo de la chingada, which politely translates to the son of the raped woman. And that phrase is commonly used, it communicates that sexual violence in Mexican imagination and the shame of sexual violence is imagined as colonial and racialized and gendered. It's the worst curse word because it evokes the history of Spanish colonial sexual violence against Indigenous women. And so when Bryan's talking about the need for spaces that are racially and ethnically specific because there are colonial and racialized dimensions as well as gendered dimensions to all this, especially when we're talking about like a white priest violator of a community of color, this is the kind of thing we're talking about, and that our communities are going to have a hard time untangling some of the inherent misogyny and homophobia in these conversations and in the shame if we're not also understanding the colonial and racial violence that shapes our feelings and imaginings about this reality. Excellent.
Thank you to all three of you for challenging us. It's really important to hear from you. So if I can just move us on, we only have a few minutes to address audience questions, but we'd like to offer at least a few for you to respond to briefly. We have audience members, I'm just looking here, we have audience members who are asking about paths to healing. Do you have examples of healing that is happening in these communities, or thoughts on what healing might look like specifically in these different communities? Throw that open to see who would like to take that question.
I can start, I think. Mm-hmm. So I'm sitting here in my office, but I'm just a feet away from the Dia de Muertos, Day of the Dead altar in my living room, which is for Catholics who celebrate this Mesoamerican indigenous practice. It's a way of remembering our deceased loved ones. For Catholics, it's tangled with memories also of All Saints and All Souls Day, and I think that what I want to lift up, connected to my comments already, is the importance in many Latina Catholic communities of popular religiosity, popular Catholicism, meaning home-based and community-based practice. For many, healing is not going to happen in the space of the clerically controlled parish, diocesan parish setting. It's going to happen where people are able to experience agency and taking control of the practices of healing and memory. And the practice that I just mentioned is one practice of healing and memory that is done in the context of family, in the context of community, and that has been done, for example, in our communities, specifically in relation to remembering victims and survivors of sexual violence.
Maka or Father Bryan, do you have anything to add about paths to healing, any healing that you have witnessed, or thoughts on what it might look like in your communities?
I would have to say that I am, in my experience and knowledge, most of those who've been sexually violated by clergy, African Americans, are coping with it on their own. There's not a lot of collective spaces for this to happen yet. That's where I think the expression coping comes in. We're coping. We're doing what we need to do. We're coping. And I think that's the very sad reality right now, is that there aren't a whole lot of institutional collective spaces for people to engage in this kind of healing. So that the healing that people are doing, it's, some are doing it, in private therapy, but again, therapy has its own problems and, expenses, and whether you're going to have insurance and all that. I think right now, I really have to honestly say that it's the expression coping really says it all, that I don't even know what healing would look like yet, because right now it's not happening on a broad enough scale with Black victims of clergy sexual abuse. That's a sad thing to say, but that's the truth right now.
Thank you for sharing the truth. Maka, I wonder if you have any thoughts on what healing might look like in Native communities.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, I don't know, maybe this is my turn to be provocative, but I'll preface this by just saying, agreeing wholeheartedly with what Jeremy has already talked about, and preface by saying that, the church in its role as sort of being the holder of the legacy of perpetrator is not needed for healing, right? Like healing is possible on an individual level. The perpetrator is never necessary in order for healing to actually occur for the individual who's been violated. At the same time, I currently work and in a capacity that, though not directly related to, well, indirectly related to the sexual abuse crisis, I work in a capacity of representing a Jesuit organization as it is trying to utilize a truth and healing process around its history as a boarding school. And what that has highlighted for me in different ways is, regardless of that truth, that the perpetrator is not necessary for healing to occur, that responsibility of the organization that represents the perpetrator to support individuals in their journey toward healing, should those individuals desire that, is extremely necessary. And one area where I feel the church has done certainly very little and needs to do a lot more. And so what healing could look like in that sense, I think is really important in terms of what we as an organization, as a church organization, ask ourselves is necessary in order to support those individuals who desire healing, who want that, and what we can provide that they need. And I think those are important questions to ask, and questions that the church needs to ask itself more.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So I'm just looking at the time, and we at Awake really make an effort to end on time. And And so I'm sorry that we're going to have to pause on the audience questions for now. We've had so many interesting topics that we have discussed tonight, and I'm so grateful to our three panelists, Father Bryan, Jeremy, and Maka, for sharing so much for us to think about. And clearly the work has just begun. So we're going to pass on to Mary Gentile from Awake's leadership team. But I don't want anyone to go anywhere because we're going to hear from our panelists one more time this evening. So please stay with us. But I'd like to just go ahead and ask Mary Gentile to share some information first. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you to our three panelists and to Aaron for moderating, and to our audience members for the questions you posed this evening. I had hoped for learning, and I certainly got that, along with much inspiration, as was also hoped for, inspiration to go and learn more. We received many excellent questions that we didn't have time to get to, and sometimes that happens. But if you sent a question, please consider joining us next week when we gather again for discussion and consideration of our next steps. As our returning attendees know, our intention with Courageous Conversations is for the conversation to lead us toward action. So we're going to invite the panelists back on screen in a moment to share action steps that they recommend. I'm going to welcome them back in a moment. We also want to let you know that our next Courageous Conversation will take place on Thursday, January 19th, 2023. We'll gather for Family Matters: How Abuse Wounds the Loved Ones of Victim Survivors. Our panelists that evening will include Jerry Vandenbosch, a member of the Awake leadership team and board of directors. She's the daughter of a clergy abuse survivor. And also Letitia Payton of Tent Makers of Louisiana, whose teenage son was abused by their parish priest in 2015. It will be a valuable conversation, so please mark your calendar. We'll share more details soon. Also, Awake will hold an online prayer service called Holy Darkness at 6:30 p.m. Central on Tuesday, December 13th. You'll see a link for registration in the follow-up email we'll send you after we wrap up tonight. That email will also include a feedback survey and a registration for part 2 of this Courageous Conversation. We hope you'll share your thoughts about tonight and that you'll join us next Thursday to discuss what you heard this evening. So now let's turn briefly back to our panelists and have each of them share an action step that they would recommend that each of us consider tonight. So Maka, if I could begin with you, what action step would you recommend our audience members take to ensure that survivors from Native American communities are no longer erased from the narrative abuse in our church?
Thank you. Yes. I would echo something that Jeremy said much earlier, which is, move your feet and take the time, especially to learn about the Native communities where you're from and in your diocese and where you live and who they are and where they are and their history and what happened and where their schools were. Take the time to learn about that, find that out. There are probably victim survivors among those communities today. And that's at least that knowledge can start to begin that eventual relationship building, but it starts with knowledge.
Miigwech. Thank you. And Jeremy, what action steps would you recommend to prevent survivors from Latinx communities from being erased from the narrative?
I would say continue learning, approaching with a spirit of curiosity and a spirit of openness. That this is a difficult conversation, especially for survivors, and because we're talking about the racial context of the abuse crisis, does not mean that anyone present who's not a person of color, for example, has not suffered gravely from the crisis, but it's to say you haven't suffered because of your whiteness or because of your Anglo-ness or because of your US citizenship. It's to say that other types of vulnerabilities created the conditions for that abuse to be possible. And so these are hard conversations. And as Maka said, we need communities, we need everyone in this room to continue these conversations and to be okay with stumbling and being wrong, being corrected, getting better at having the conversation. All of us get better at having this conversation by doing it repeatedly and having that spirit of curiosity and openness to doing it better.
Thank you for that good reminder. And last but not least, Father Bryan, what action steps do you suggest?
I'm going to offer 2 action steps. One, I will return to where I began by talking about that inner city parishioner who wrote in the 1990s and said she didn't want the inner city to be missed or forgotten. And so the action step I would say is that shouldn't just be on her or the residents of the inner city. I would offer the challenge that when Awake or other groups gather, to look around and to say, if we are only or overwhelmingly white, what do we need to do to make sure that the other communities are not missed and are not forgotten? I think they have that consciously top of mind in terms of saying that we will not let these other groups be missed or forgotten. And that means that we need to ask the question deliberately, who's not present here? Who's not present here? And the second thing I would offer is this something that Jeremy said when you're talking about the prayer altar in your home. We need to pray. And I'm not a person that believes in praying it away, but I'm also know that I can't do the work that I do in dealing with these issues of race and sexuality if I wasn't rooted in something that was both bigger and deeper than I am. And that sometimes where people say, oh, you have the courage to say difficult things, I say, I don't have the courage. I don't know where it came from, but it's coming from something other than me. And if we're going to have these kind of courageous conversations and name the pain of abuse and also its racial and ethnic inflections, then we need to have the courage to do that. And it can only come if we are rooted in something that is bigger and deeper than we are. And that means more than just saying prayers, it means to be people of prayer. And I don't know if we've yet cultivated, I think there are some victim survivor communities that are doing it, but a genuine spirituality of courage and of courageous hospitality and courageous prophetic speech. I think that's the kind of spirituality we need to cultivate if we're really going to become a force for healing and justice in our church and our society.
Father Bryan, thank you. And a heartfelt thanks to all of our panelists this evening. Father Bryan set us up for our closing here. The leadership of Awake is motivated by our faith, and to do this work of listening to and learning from survivors' prayer is important to us. So when we gather, we pray together. We will end tonight with a short prayer, and we invite anyone who wishes to stay on to join us in that prayer. But we know there are good reasons why some may not choose to stay. And so if you wish to sign off now, know that we wish you peace and goodness, and that we hope to see you again. As we begin our closing prayer, let's remind ourselves that, as always, we are in the presence of God, who is love. And feeling that presence now, we collect ourselves, knowing that listening is an act of love. Thank you, loving God, for bringing us together this evening and giving us this gift of listening to witnesses and wisdom that we have heard tonight. May the Spirit help us use what we have learned to take action. In and through all that we do going forth, may we hold each other in our hearts, each doing our part to cultivate love, hope, and healing that leaves no one out and no one behind as we strive to build the beloved community. Amen. Thank you all for joining us this evening. Good night.